morning to our viewers in the US. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and beyond. Last year, we asked Peter Rao, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, to give us his perspective in an opinion piece on how the United States feels about the European Union's China policy. We talked about the paper long before the November 3rd election. Peter's analysis was published a few weeks ago and, from what I know, has already attracted many readers in Europe as well. I would like to take this opportunity to thank him once again for his work and his efforts. Today, we would like to continue our close and successful cooperation with Hudson Institute and discuss the topic and the main points of Peter's paper. Because, of course, the relationship with China remains a priority not only in the US among politicians of both major parties, and also under the new administration of President Joe Biden. In Europe, too, the question on how the continent should respond to China's growing influence has been gaining ground for several years. We are pleased to be joined in this discussion by Peter Rao, of course, and from Germany by Dr. Gudrun Wacker, Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, in German Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP, and last but not least, from the United States by Noah Barkin, Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Managing Editor of Rhodium Group's China's Practice. But first, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Hudson Institute and pass the microphone to Joel Scanlon, Vice President for Studies at Hudson, for his welcome remarks. I hope we have a stimulating and interesting discussion and virtual event. Thank you for joining us. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Joel Scanlon, Vice President for Studies at Hudson Institute. We're very pleased to partner for today's event with our friends at Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and are grateful for their support of the study that is the basis for today's discussion. In recent years, geopolitical and economic fault lines have come more clearly into view, challenging long-held views about the direction of international politics, the foundations of the world order, and even the strength of the Transatlantic alliance. The central disruption, of course, has been the aggressive rise of China. At Hudson Institute, we have made the study of China's rise a core component of our research across our disciplines, from the Chinese Communist Party's strategy of total competition in the South China Sea, to its predatory economic model, to its plans to dominate advanced industries, to its military modernization and buildup, to its global influence operations and corruption of multilateral institutions, to its destruction of democracy in Hong Kong, to its 21st century genocide against Uyghur Muslims. Today's event marks another opportunity for Hudson to feature and analyze China's rise, this time through the lens of transatlantic relations. Whether and how longtime allies can find a common understanding and common strategy in the face of the risks presented by China is an open question. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn that conversation over to my colleague, Peter Rao, to attempt to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. And I would echo Joel's praise of Paul Linares and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. I'd also like to add my thanks to Janine Laro, who has done yeoman's work at CUS to put today's event together. I'm thrilled to host today's discussion. My name, as Joel mentioned, is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson, and I'm very delighted to have two experts with us today of great repute. Gudrun Wacker is senior fellow in the Asia practice of Stiftung Wissenschaft Politik, SWP, otherwise known, as Paul put it, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She also is the driving force behind an annual conference, the Berlin Conference on Asian Security, and hosts Track 2 dialogues with the Shanghai Institute for International Affairs. She is also, since 2018, an EU rep at the ASEAN Regional Forum for Experts and Eminent Persons. I suppose we usually save this for high priests of the Roman Catholic Church, but today we can say, welcome your eminence to Gudrun Wacker. And most recently, I read with great interest a piece she co-authored with François Goudemont of Institut Montaigne. Institut Montaigne is really a leading voice in Paris. SWP has a great reputation across Europe and in the United States, but is really known for the advice it gives German Parliament and German government. And so Berlin and Paris a joint axis looking out on Sino-European relations. I would commend that piece to everybody, and we might come to it here in a little bit. I'm also thrilled to have Noah Barkin with us today. Noah, as Paul mentioned, is the managing editor in the China Practice of Rhodium Group, a private sector organization. He's also a senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, so a colleague of sorts. He is a journalist, trained journalist, hailing from California, but today coming to us from Berlin, from where he watches Sino-European relations. As a journalist, he's held many positions for Reuters, including bureau chief and Europe correspondent. He's also had other institutional affiliations, such as with AICGS, the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, and the Mercator Institute in Berlin for China Studies. Noah has written, and his musings have appeared in many top-flight publications that our viewers would recognize. And today marks the opening day for his podcast. I'm not sure what it's called, Noah. Perhaps you could give it a pitch here. But it is based off of a widely popular a monthly magazine, I should say newsletter, that he publishes on the GMF website called Watching China in Europe. So Noah, I'm not sure, what is the name of your podcast? We can do that. We can do that right now.
My podcast is called Watching China in Europe, which is the same name as my newsletter. So thanks for highlighting that, Peter.
That's right. And his first guest is Martin Selmayr, who was, of course, Jean-Claude Juncker's right-hand man in Brussels for many years. Today, his event is hooked to an essay that I published, Europe's China Chimera, just last month, a few weeks ago, although it was drafted in large part during the middle to late stages of last year. And I thought I would begin with a few opening remarks on why I wrote this essay, and then we can turn it to Gudrun and Noah for some opening remarks on the essay if they like, although it need not drive the entire conversation, also about their views on Sino-European relations before we have more of an open-ended conversation. So the reason why I wrote this essay is really threefold. And the first reason is that clearly last year, after Joe Biden had won the Democratic nomination for president, it was obvious that senior Democratic Party foreign policy officials who would go on to serve in important roles in the Biden administration were going to elevate China in the transatlantic relationship. Of course, there are other issues that are crowding the agenda and that are important to the Biden team, such as renegotiation of the JCPOA with Iran, climate and trade issues, just to name three topics. But when Jake Sullivan visited Hudson last year in a dialogue with Walter Russell Mead, my colleague here, he mentioned China as one metric by which we should judge the health of transatlantic relations in a Biden era. And so I do think that the Biden team looks at the world, although this comes from a Republican administration, perhaps through something like Kissingerian geometry. There are three real power centers in the world: the United States, Europe, and China. And it's best to be in the partnership of two in that three-way power structure. Beyond that, obviously, the Biden team has put the multilateral formats and fora at the center of their worldview, and Europe commands a great deal of importance. One could even argue it's a bit overrepresented in places like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and so forth and so on. It's also essential, I think, in standards-making fora, which is in a big part of the economic competition or relationship between the United States and China. So knowing that for the Biden team, China policy wouldn't entirely run through Europe, but certainly be in part vetted, scrubbed, and coordinated with Europe, I wanted to look at the state of Sino-European relations. Secondly, I think during the Trump administration, we've experienced a bit of a change in China's strategy, which itself, I think, I don't mean American China strategy, I mean China's outlook onto the world, which itself I would say is true for really three reasons. The first is that I think Beijing has concluded that the United States is demonstrating weakness and may be in decline. This might have begun with the surprising struggles of the Americans with the insurgency in the sands of Iraq at the beginning of the century, but then I think it really picked up pace during the financial crisis, and then the election of Donald Trump certainly flummoxed Beijing. So I think they see the United States and perhaps the American model, more importantly, as less powerful and attractive and dominant as they may have in decades past. This happened to come at the very same time that Xi Jinping took over leadership of the Communist Party. And more than any of his recent predecessors, at least since I've been watching international affairs, say Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, She is set to crack down both domestically and consolidate power, but also I think to push out a newfound aggressiveness on the global stage. And so American weakness or decline in the views of Beijing took place at the same time that a leader took power who wanted to really stake China's claim on the world stage. And then third, I think, is President Trump's somewhat brashness, one could say, almost in China policy. I think the Chinese calculated in watching Trump that they could gain little from the traditional, we could encapsulate in the slogan, hides one's capabilities and bides one's time. And so they pressed out more aggressively. All of that combined, I think, before the pandemic, and then the pandemic, and this is almost a banality given how often it's been written and said, but I think it's nonetheless true, became something of an accelerator. One had in Wuhan an outbreak, which perhaps owing to the governance structure and crackdowns under Xi's early years, led local officials to perhaps be less than forthright about the state of affairs in their province, caused the virus then to go nationwide. And then I think Xi's newfound, one could call it contempt, aggressiveness on the international stage towards the WHO and other countries around the world caused a national pandemic to go really global. So another reason why I think it was important to look at Sino-European relations is because China in and of itself was changing in its global strategy. And then the third and most obvious reason why I think it's useful to look at Sino-European relations is because one should test the assumption that the democratic allies of the West really have a similar worldview when it comes to China. And here I think some skepticism is in order. For one, if we look back at maybe the major competitions of years past and the biggest near-peer competition the United States has faced in the last centuries with the Soviet Union, the Americans really thought, and I think this is a prevailing attitude in the United States, that the Cold War was won through peace through strength. But I think if you ask Germans why the Cold War was won, they would point also to Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, Wandel durch Handel. And so the natural response to China for the United States is perhaps to go in a slightly different direction, learning the lessons of its recent past than Europe or Germany in particular, which might find that commercial ties in a form of, as my colleague Mike Duran puts it, ameliorative diplomacy, searching for cooperative opportunities with the Chinese, is not really the way the United States approaches China. And then aside from those attitudinal differences, there's one big structural factor, and that is that the United States is the major hard power actor in Asia Pacific. And Germany is now debating how, when, and if to send a frigate through the Straits of Malacca into Asia Pacific. They're just fundamentally occupying different places on the global chessboard. So those are really the three motivators for why I thought looking at this issue would be important. Also, three reasons why I read Noah's newsletter with great attention, and why Gudrun Wacker's work, I think, is so valued by Americans who, especially during a pandemic, can't travel to Berlin and have similar insights. Since I drafted the paper, there have been a few developments that I would just raise. One is Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, has spoken at the WEF and the MSC, the World Economic Forum, where the major headline coming away was that, just to kind of sum it up bluntly and crassly, she did not believe in forming a geopolitical bloc to counter the United States or counter China. Then at the MSC, she talked about the importance of developing alternatives to China. And so I think the Americans, which are very much so still in a review process on their China policy, the Secretary of Defense just held his first meeting at the Pentagon with his China Review Policy Group. The White House is working on these issues, are still working their way through on what this all means. But China hasn't, of course, sat still. RCEP was a major trade agreement that the Chinese were able to push through with ASEAN partners. I think there are 15 members to that agreement. Thereafter, of course, the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments with Europe, was struck. This was after I finished drafting the paper, but I managed to include it nonetheless. I have some objections to CAI, which perhaps we can get to later, but I would sum them up the way Wendy Cutler from a longstanding Democratic Party trade negotiator put it, really twofold. One is political. I worry that trade negotiators, once they've struck an agreement, are bound to sell it as they go through ratification. And so one has the contrast of, on the one hand, the Netherlands designating the actions in Xinjiang by the Chinese government as a genocide, On the other hand, the demands of getting ratification for a trade deal, forcing trade negotiations and political actors to go out and sell the relationship with China. And then the other is that I worry, of course, it's not a trade deal, it's an investment deal, but it will lead to further economic integration to a point where the options Europe has to extricate from some of these, should there be a political blowback in the China-Europe relationship, will be constricted. But anyways, the CAI, I think, represents one, a Chinese entry point into Europe through the traditional big power capitals, Paris and Berlin, one could say now that the UK is outside of the European Union. And the other is the 17+1 format, of course, through Southern and Eastern Europe, which just held a summit that was widely panned, in part because the representative level of the Eastern and Southern European participants was relatively low. Maybe I'll just sum up by saying the basic thesis of my paper is that, in my view, China is using an economic stratagem to insinuate itself on the European continent, ultimately to try and somewhat, to use a term from the Cold War, Finlandize the continent, to make Europe neutral with respect to anything that China truly deeply cares about, not marginal issues, but central issues. And secondly, that it's using that economic relationship to power its economy, to make it the premier economy in key industries, so that in the future, it isn't Europe exporting to China, but the European consumer market ending up as an end destination for China. And Huawei is really a harbinger for that. So I've raised a lot of issues there, and Gudrun Wacker, you feel free to respond to any or none of that. But I thought I'd give you an opportunity, since you're sitting at a very impressive and elite think tank in Berlin, to give us the view on Sino-European relations. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I want to say one thing to start with, which you just referred to in your introduction, and that's that the keeping a low profile was dropped by China as a response to Donald Trump. But actually, this process basically starts with Xi Jinping coming to power. The factors you mentioned, especially the global financial crisis, for me, this is the watershed event, and then coming together with Xi Jinping formulating a much more ambitious agenda, which is not uncontroversial in China. Many old diplomats think this was too early to take on this ambitious sort of agenda. I thought I'm gonna mainly refer to your paper and address 3 points. The first is the EU-China relationship, how I see it. And then the second point is, what does the EU and Germany want to avoid? I think this is very important to see the difference between the two approaches. And the third part, I will address the transatlantic cooperation. So first on EU's China policy, I want to say that we are not at the verge of becoming a fiefdom of China. And actually, I think that the EU has made quite some progress, surprising for me, progress over the last couple of years. I think, let's say the last 5 years, there has been a rethinking about our approach to China. And it really starts with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the 16+1. And for Germany, I think the Made in China 2025, which was published in 2015, that was a wake-up call. So the wake-up call is in two directions. One is China's presence in Europe, which becomes much more clear with the 16+1 and the Belt and Road Initiative. And the other is China's ambitions for the future in terms of dominating the global market in certain sectors. So this is for the German industry really a wake-up call. So I think in terms of the analysis, we are not so different from where the US has been in the last 4 years under Donald Trump, but the methods were completely different. Our conclusion was that if we can't change China and our leverage is limited, we have to do more to strengthen the European Union and to make it more resilient to this new actor and its activities in Europe, because we have never met a company like Huawei or, you know, these state-owned enterprises. So we see that over the last couple of years, the EU has developed a sort of toolbox consisting of many elements, starting with the investment screening mechanism that was initiated in 2017. Then there was a report by 27 of 28 EU ambassadors to China on the Belt and Road Initiative, warning to adopt the sort of Chinese narrative on the Belt and Road. There was the very important paper of the Federation of German Industries in January 2019 and the strategic outlook. Now, I admit that it will be very, very difficult to balance these three dimensions of the EU-China relationship, to see it as a cooperation partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival at the same time. This will be difficult, but the toolbox is supposed to help, at least in the areas where, you know, the EU has a mandate. They also published a toolbox on 5G, for example, a white paper on foreign subsidies. I could go on, but will not do so in the interest of time. Now, on the KAI, this is not an agreement. It's an agreement in principle to have an agreement. So we're not there yet, and it's expected that this will take about 1.5 years, and it's not clear at all whether this will be ratified by the European Parliament. And I agree with you that December 2020 was the worst possible moment to do this and send the wrong signal in two directions, in the direction of the United States and also in the direction of China, sort of coming with an agreement when we see how much human rights situation has deteriorated, etc. And there is a big debate going on within the European Union. But in the end, I think it was a dilemma for the, you know, agreement that has been negotiated for 7 years. And of course, Xi Jinping made some concessions because he knew that this would sort of make transatlantic restart more difficult. So anyway, agree on, you know, the controversial nature of this agreement. Parallel to all the toolbox efforts, etc., I think the EU has done several other things, and also Germany. One is to work towards strengthening and reforming international organizations. There is this initiative of the Alliance of Multilateralists, which is supposed to bring other democratic parties into the boat, also probably a reaction to Donald Trump and, you know, the withdrawal from international organizations. And I think what we also can notice is that the EU, or at least member states, have spoken out more clearly on human rights violations and on controversial issues. There is, for example, a note verbal to the United Nations that was handed in by France, Germany, and the UK on the South China Sea and China's behavior there. Then when you look at Wang Yi's visit to Europe in last September, I was surprised about the uniform messaging on the side of the Europeans, even Italy. He got basically the same message on Hong Kong and in Xinjiang in every capital he went to. So we're not as bad as I get the impression you describe us in your paper. More needs to be done. And one thing is that we need to finalize and improve the toolbox at the EU level. The investment screening mechanism in the end has to be legally binding. We're not there yet at all. And then another important issue, which I allude to in the paper I wrote with François Godemont, is that decisions in foreign and security policy of the EU have to be taken by qualified majority vote and not unanimous. Otherwise, we will always have the lowest common denominator. So my second point is shorter, I can promise, what Germany and the EU want to avoid. I think broad decoupling, either in economic terms or a bifurcation of the international system, this is not what the European Union wants to see. There is no appetite for a new era of, two opposing blocs, not at all. So everything they try to do is to avoid this kind of scenario. And you see that very clearly in the German guidelines on the Indo-Pacific, which were published last September. One of Germany's basic interests has the title neither unipolar nor bipolar. No country should be forced to choose between two sides or fall into a state of unilateral dependency. So that's the formulated interest. This was also taken up by the Netherlands. The France, in their own Indo-Pacific strategy, talk of a multipolar region. But I think we can see from that this is not something we only aspire for the Indo-Pacific, but also for ourselves. We don't want to be the playground for two opposing powers. And here I think that the European Union is in sync with the majority of countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And if you look, you mentioned the RCEP yourself in your introduction. I mean, it's American allies that joined this trade agreement. Australia, South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand are all in. The only one that opted out was India, but that was way before the Indian-Chinese problem started last year. I also want to make crystal clear that despite all the, some people's, flirting with the idea of equidistance, this is not really on the table because it is very clear that in the end, we are much closer to the United States in terms of values, norms, standards than to China. So the equidistance is kind of a delusionary idea, but it's about avoiding a certain scenario. Final point on the transatlantic relations. I think I do not exaggerate when I say that the last 4 years have been quite a challenge, but there were actually efforts going on to coordinate and cooperate with respect to China. Probably more so than ever before, because the situation has become more pressing, including from the perspective of the EU. But it is very difficult to do that when the EU itself, and especially Germany, are targets of the criticism of the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself. Also, the withdrawal of the US from a lot of international agreements and organizations was seen with great concern, not only because it weakens multilateralism, which is basically the European DNA, but also because it provided opportunities for China to expand its own role and voice and weight in these organizations. So basically it created an opportunity for China. I think now with the Biden administration, there is not only the willingness, but we also see the necessity to restart the transatlantic coordination and cooperation. And there are many good proposals on the table made by many think tanks on your side of the Atlantic and on our side of the Atlantic. So this is really, we have it all there, we can pick and choose. But I think, and this is my final word, I think the US should not underestimate how much damage has been done in the last 4 years to its credibility as an ally and partner. If you look at Pew public opinion polls, Yes, the people in Germany who believe that Xi Jinping will do the right thing is 17%. But if you ask them, will Donald Trump do the right thing? It's 10%. So keep that in perspective. And there are grave concerns that 4 years from now, there might be a similar personality in the White House. And what do we do then? So the conclusion is, yes, we want to cooperate with, and restart transatlantic cooperation and coordination. I think with respect to China, it's not clear yet where exactly the Biden administration is going, although we have some speeches, we had a first phone call. We also have some articles published by the main advisors of Joe Biden on Asia, among them Kurt Campbell. So we have a rough picture where they will probably be going. But in order to be a good partner for the United States, the EU needs to map its own interests and objectives with respect to China. Otherwise, we are not a good cooperation partner, but we will just, follow the US, and this is not in our interest. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that view from Berlin. Lots of issues mentioned there to discuss, but first let's go to Noah. And Noah, what's on your mind?
Well, first of all, thanks, Peter, for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and thanks for the nice introduction and the plug for my newsletter. I was in the audience in Davos back in 2017 when Xi Jinping gave that speech that you use to sort of frame your paper, and there was a lot of swooning going on the European side. I can confirm that. This was just days before Trump was being inaugurated. And what struck me was how well Xi understood his audience in Davos. His messaging was pitch perfect for a group of people who really wanted to hear multilateralism is not dead, globalization is not dead, everyone should be working with each other. But that was 4 years ago, but it really feels like a different era now. I think the world is in a very different place. And I wanted to make sort of 4 broader points, and I'll try to be quick to leave time for our discussion about 4 broader points about EU-China, but also transatlantic China relations, sort of riffing off of some of the arguments in your paper, which I thought was very interesting. First, I don't think there's any question that the US and Europe are in a different place as far as China goes right now. And I think the fundamental difference between the 2 sides is that Europe has not given up on the idea of binding China into a sort of rules-based global system. Xi played on this in Davos 4 years ago. I think that was the prime motivation behind this investment agreement. But of course, if you look at Washington these days, I think, I'm safe in saying that most people have given up on this notion. There isn't a lot of patience in the US right now for reforming institutions like the WTO. There's no faith, I think, and I think for good reason, that China is going to be playing ball there. And in Europe, this faith, Europe is clinging to this faith, and there is patience to reform these institutions. I don't think there is an acceptance in Europe that the post-war order as we knew it is sort of coming to an end, and we're heading into a new world that will require new thinking and new ways of working together. Second point, I think it's important to remember that we are only at the beginning of what I think is going to be a generational, perhaps a multi-generational challenge for the US and other democratic nations in responding to the rise of China. Europe's position, as Gudrun just mentioned, has evolved quite a bit over the past years. I think there's no question about that. I personally don't think it's moving fast enough, but I think we all need to sort of take a deep breath. This is going to be a marathon. We're dealing with some very complex issues around technology and supply chains. And there's no real alternative to transatlantic cooperation on China, I think. I think both sides need time to sort their approach out. I don't think either side at the moment is crystal clear on its approach at the moment. Third point, while I do think the Trump administration deserves praise for putting China at the center of US foreign policy and raising awareness with allies, which I think it certainly did, I defer, and I'm echoing Gudrun's message here, defer a little bit with what you write in the paper, Peter, about how effective Trump's strategy on China was overall. I'm not sure we'd have European strategic autonomy if it wasn't for the past 4 years of Trump. And I think we need to remember China is not aiming to pull Europe into its camp. I don't think it sees that as a realistic option. Its aim is to ensure that Europe is not sort of firmly ensconced in the US camp. And I think the past 4 years have helped quite a bit in that regard. So I think we need to return to a transatlantic dialogue. We need to rebuild some trust. That does not mean sugarcoating the message. I think the Biden administration needs to keep up the pressure on European capitals when it comes to China, do that in a more constructive way. And I think you need to develop a positive agenda that's not all about pushing back against China. It's going to have to be about investing in ourselves, forging common standards for the digital world, offering third countries an alternative to China. So my last point is that I think China's behavior over the coming years will be really decisive in both the transatlantic positioning on China, but also Europe's positioning on China. If you look back at 2020, we've had a year, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, tensions with India, tensions with Australia, wolf warriors, mass diplomacy. Now we have vaccine diplomacy. If this continues, and I think there's a good reason to think it will, hopefully the pandemic will be over soon, but I think this behavior is likely to continue, then this is going to push Europe and the US closer together. Now I think we can, and I think Peter, you make this point in your paper, we can expect China to try to play Europe off against the US, handing out gifts to European companies at the expense of American firms. I think China will be sending a signal that it won't cooperate on climate if other countries are pushing back in other areas. So Europe can't fall into that trap. But I think coming back to some of the points that Gudrun made, if you look at public opinion in Europe, at what the media is saying, what the think tanks are saying, I do think we're headed in a more hawkish direction on China across Europe. And I think that's primarily going to be driven by China's behavior going forward. I will stop there and pass it back to you, Peter.
Great, thanks. Well, one theme that seemed to weave its way through both of your remarks was this notion that there's going to be an attempt from the European side to build up these compartments, and of course, there's the famous European Union formulation to this point. You just mentioned it in the context of a climate policy, which would be an obvious opportunity for cooperation. I suppose some also frame it. I think ECFR had a paper recently calling it a competition area. But irrespective, John Kerry and his European counterparts are going to want to work with China on climate issues. Gudrun, I think you talked about how Europe has these compartments and they don't want to decouple, but they have a toolkit. And so I'm wondering how this all works together, because for compartments to work, to have areas of rivalry, of competition, or of cooperation, whatever they might be, don't you need both partners to see the world that way? Because if you begin to implement the toolbox, and if Europe becomes more aggressive on, say, investment screening at the national level, and China then begins to put cooperation areas at risk. Do you think Europe will stand its ground? Is it prepared to really execute that policy then? Or where do you see kind of the texture of European resilience on this? I ask this question in part because Dan Eichenson, who runs the Trade Policy Center at the Cato Institute, so he's a free trader through and through, given the nature of that organization, had an interesting piece recently where the conclusion was, if you decouple in sensitive technological areas, he thinks the entire trading relationship begins to unravel. And so can you really keep kind of a sanitary difference between key technological areas and others? Perhaps Gudrun, you could pick up on this issue of compartments and decoupling, and then Noah, if you have any thoughts on it.
I should say I'm not an economist, so and this whole area is, I don't know whether this is a correct assumption that the whole relationship will, or the economic relationship will unravel if you take out certain pieces. But I think this is an old problem of the European Union, and this is also my criticism, for example, of the German Indo-Pacific guidelines. We don't prioritize. We make a laundry list. We are very comprehensive in our approach. We would like to compartmentalize, into these are areas where you can cooperate. These are areas where we compete. Competition is probably the easiest one. And then there is the systemic rival part. The problem is, what do we do if there is a connection between these areas? And there, I think the problem is, if you have no priorities, you cannot make the hard choices. And I think what Europe needs most, and what is probably lacking most here, is to have contingencies in place. We don't think through certain scenarios and what we would do. There is a very interesting novel by an anonymous writer. I don't know whether you have read that. It's called Ultimatum. It's about the US and China, and ultimately trading Taiwan against climate change. And China has already made clear that, this is a hypothetical scenario, but this is basically what you alluded to. This could be some of the choices. China doesn't allow us to compartmentalize, but says, if we give you this, we will expect something else in return. I don't know whether we're prepared for that. And that's the difficulty with these three components of our relationship with China, that it's unclear how we will balance this, especially if there is a connection, for example, between human rights and our trade relationship in terms of supply chains. This is another topic the EU has been working on. It's very difficult, but it will be the same difficulty for the US when it wants to cooperate with China in certain areas. Only I believe that the US is much clearer about its strategic priorities than the EU.
Well, it's also, I think, why China has been so effective in not only building relationships with key businesses, but really politically sensitive businesses like Volkswagen, for example, in the German economy. Noah, what are your thoughts about compartmentalizing and the liability of this?
Yeah, no, I think compartmentalizing is a real potential problem. I would agree with Gudrun that this it's really about finding the balance between these elements. You have 27 EU countries. I think this strategic outlook for China, which came out 2 years ago and contained this sort of trinity of partner, competitor, and rival, was a pretty good document at the time, and it allowed all EU countries to sort of swing behind this document. But it's about striking a balance, and I think what we've seen is a sort of swinging of the pendulum. We had leading up to this strategic outlook 2 years ago, this is a sort of gradual hardening of the line, and then we saw it swing back. Merkel kind of worrying about the focus being too much on the rival side of things and focusing on partnership, on climate, getting the investment agreement done. And I wouldn't exclude that we now see a swing back in the other direction in reaction to all the criticism around the investment agreement. And of course the discussion with the Biden administration is gonna kick off soon. So there is this pendulum and that is swinging back and forth, and Europe is still struggling to kind of find the right balance. On the decoupling issue, I think targeted decoupling is really the only way forward. One has to remember that despite the Trump administration's very aggressive push, U.S. companies are still very invested. If you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the AmCham surveys, U.S. companies are still very ensconced in China and depend on China. European companies as well. So not a lot has happened. So I think we're going to see diversification. I think we do need a sort of targeted decoupling approach, which takes into account national security concerns, which are very legitimate. But this broad idea of sort of severing ties with the second biggest economy in the world, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think the Biden administration sees it that way, and I don't think Europe is gonna buy into that approach. So hopefully the two sides can come together on a more measured, targeted approach to that.
Yeah, I suppose we've already seen a preview of this with Huawei, which is in a form a very minor targeted decoupling. There was never a coupling to begin with, but you could see right away the Chinese coming back with threats to European market share, among other things, if they were not to give Huawei access. So I suppose we can, if there is targeted coupling at kind of technical levels, there being a counter move from Beijing. And then the question to me is, does the broader relationship unravel? Does Europe stand its ground? Where does the United States come in? But one country that is not bound by the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment and has struck out its own policy, in part probably because of the historical legacy with Hong Kong and Australia, which have been kind of the battering rams of China policy in 2020, is of course the United Kingdom. We're talking a lot about European Union toolkits, European Union policy. How does the UK fit into this puzzle? Noah, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I think the dust is still settling on Brexit, and I think there is a bit of reluctance both in the EU and also in London to kind of embrace each other at the moment. I think Boris Johnson is trying to sort of show his vision for global Britain, whatever that means. So I think it's going to take some time, but I think, especially with the Biden administration coming back in, this kind of E3 idea is going to come back, especially on some of these human rights issues. I think just today there was sort of, I don't know if it was E3 or broader, but some common action on or common signals sent on human rights in Russia and the Navalny case. So I am hopeful. I think Europe needs to work with the UK. I think the UK obviously is undergoing a major shift in its approach to China. And I think that the EU and the UK need to work very closely together. Hopefully they can.
If I may say something, I mean, I think that the direction in which the UK is going is not clear yet. It's clear that the EU wants to keep the UK as close as possible. I mean, France has always been interested in that, and there is, in terms of security policy, etc. And I think we see some signals in that direction. But it's expected that the UK will this year come out with some sort of, Indo-Pacific fleshing out of global Britain. And I wouldn't be so convinced that the China turn to the negative is as sustainable as your paper seems to hint in some places. I mean, that parliaments are very critical of China, and this commission you mentioned that that was established by the British Parliament, that's not unusual. I mean, in all European countries, the parliaments are most critical of China because they don't have to make the decisions in the end. I mean, they do now in Germany when it comes to Huawei, I suppose, but usually they don't make the foreign and security decisions. And so they're more outspoken on human rights and on all these issues. So I'm curious to see, because in the UK, there are different voices how to deal with China, and whether the UK can afford to, you know, not broker some sort of FTA with China. I don't know where they will come out in the end. But the hope is that there will be a strong and very narrow coordination. And this is probably also something I have to underline for the European Union. We need to make China a topic at every ministerial meeting in the EU, you know, in every venue, to improve the horizontal coordination and bringing everybody on the same page. There will always be outliers like Greece and Hungary, you know, there are some candidates for that. But there is also the possibility that you then do something, it's 27 minus 1 or 27 minus 2 or 3 or 4. And this is European too. So we need more. I think one of the questions you raised in one of the emails was, is the French-German axis enough to sort of push EU-China policy? No, it's not. We need the countries, and you see with the Indo-Pacific initiative that very early on France and Germany brought the Netherlands into the boat and looked for support among other member states to bring that on the agenda of the European Union.
Well, maybe I'll just pick up there then and ask whether or not, since you mentioned Indo-Pacific strategy, both the German strategy that was published and what is looming with the Brits. I mean, the Brits are sending an aircraft carrier to the Asia-Pacific. They've offered Hong Kongers pathways to citizenship and taken a few other steps. But I guess my larger question is, and we can make it twofold. One, is there a hard power role for Europe in the Indo-Pacific? We've seen some freedom of navigation operations from the French, but beyond that, and secondly, what should be the role of NATO? Wes Mitchell and Thomas de Maizière just published an important reflection paper at the urging of Jens Stoltenberg. It may be a basis for discussion in the upcoming NATO summit this spring. Of course, China was mentioned at the NATO summit in the closing document last year. Is there a NATO role? Should there be more NATO-EU coordination? What's the role of hard power in the Indo-Pacific? Any thoughts in that direction, Gudrun, that you have?
I think NATO is explicitly mentioned in the guidelines of the German government and also explicitly mentioned in the non-paper that the Netherlands published. The global partnerships of NATO are mentioned explicitly. They're not mentioned in the French paper or strategy papers. I mean, France is the only country that says we are a resident power in the region, right? They have their overseas territories there. They have 1.6 million citizens there. They have 8,000 military personnel there. Germany is, for historical reasons, very, very careful about these things. But there is the commitment of our Minister of Defense to send a frigate to the region. This is more a symbolic gesture to show that we care about the freedom of navigation, and we believe in UNCLOS, and the whole Indo-Pacific guidelines are about, you know, a rules-based, maintaining a rules-based order where might does not make right. This is very much in the interest of the EU. I think European countries do play a role that they don't like to talk about a lot, and that's in terms of arms exports to the region. We always claim we play no hard security role here, but actually the arms exports are quite substantial. I mean, of France, but also of Germany and other European states. So, but this is a topic that does not fall into under the authority of the European Union, which is a problem. We have to discuss these things, you know, and not say, but we don't have a hard security role here. Nevertheless, in terms of security, I see the role of the EU more in terms of non-traditional issues. And I think there have been talks within the, NATO, thinking in the direction of cybersecurity, for example, as one important issue that could link NATO with the region.
I suppose my one, just real quick, my one concern about a European hard power component in the Asia Pacific is in the event of war over Taiwan, which was mentioned earlier, whether or not European naval forces would basically be cut off without command control resupply. They'd have to rely, I think, extensively on the United States, which would be busy if the U.S. came to the aid of Taiwan. As the American Indo-Pacific guidelines spelled out that were published recently. But anyways, Noah, what are your thoughts about hard power, NATO, and Asia Pacific?
Yeah, well, I think if you listen to what Kurt Campbell has been saying, whether in foreign affairs or other venues, he talks a lot about getting Europe engaged in the Asia region. And I think we need to look at that sort of holistically, not just sort of military hard power, but also connectivity, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and all that. It's about offering countries an alternative to China in the region. And so I think there will be a real push from the Biden administration for Europeans to get involved. I don't think there's huge expectations about their involvement beyond, the UK and France on the military, on the hard security front. But I think Europe will be certainly under pressure, and I think the US side will be asking Europe to play a role in the region. And as Gudrun mentioned, we've had these series of Indo-Pacific strategies come out. So Europe is talking about it. That's a good sign.
All right. Well, I think our time has expired. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Lots of questions that I wish we could follow up for another hour, 2 or 3. And we could even delve into domestic American politics, whether or not a similar personality, as Gudrun Wacker posed it, has a chance of becoming president in 4 years, but that'll have to wait for another day. Thank you both for joining us from Berlin with your expertise. Thanks again to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and to my colleagues at Hudson for supporting today's event. And if you want to check out my paper, you can find it on the CAS and Hudson websites. Thanks again. See you all soon, and have a wonderful day wherever you are.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for having me.